So the crime scene investigation team is made up of legal professionals like police officers and detectives, scientific professionals such as coroners, and specialists like toxicologists or fingerprint specialists who work together to solve a crime. Now, there are 7 S's of crime scene investigation. First, the first responding officer must make sure the scene is secure by first making sure all individuals in the area are safe, and second, preserve evidence. Okay? Make sure that nobody else touches it and it doesn't get contaminated. Then we have to separate the witnesses. Now, witnesses must not be allowed to talk to one another. Do you remember why? Sometimes when they're able to talk about, well, did you see what I saw? Well, I didn't see that. Oh my goodness. Well, then I saw this. Well, from my perspective, I saw this. Well, then pretty soon they all have the same story, but none of it's actually correct. Okay, so the witnesses need to be separated. Third, scan the scene. Okay, the primary and secondary crime scenes must be determined, and decisions regarding where photos should be taken are made. So you might be asking, what's the difference between the primary and the secondary crime scene? Well, a primary crime scene might be where the body was actually found, okay, if a body's involved. A secondary crime scene is going to be where did the altercation start? Maybe it starts in one room of an apartment or house and ends in another. Do you follow me? That's the difference. Then you have to see the scene. So photographs of the overall area as well as close-up photos with and without a measuring ruler should be taken. Do you remember from our observation unit? Why is that important? Why does the ruler need to be in the image? So that way we can determine perspective, so we can identify size, okay? Now, it's also important to note entry and exit points. So if, for example, something happened inside that room in the picture, okay, we would need to have that image depicting the entrance. Now, why do you think that entrance is important? Notice how the door slides. It doesn't swing open, okay? That might affect the progress of events during the actual crime. Now, is there another exit? Is there another way out? Is there a window anywhere? Or was that the only entry and exit point? So these are all things that an investigative officer is going to have to pay attention to. Next, we'd have to sketch the scene. So a rough sketch and a neater final copy of the crime scene needs to be drawn to scale, okay? This is important because it indicates all of the evidence that is found at the crime scene. So we use a measurement technique in which there are 2 measurements for each piece of evidence. And I apologize because that little picture right there is kind of covering things up for you. So why is that important? To measure every piece of evidence from 2 fixed points. So for example, if I'm looking at where this body was found, I would have to measure maybe from that corner, because that's a fixed point, and from that corner, because that's a fixed point. Think about it. Why can't I measure the body to the table? Is that a fixed point? The table could be moved. Maybe the table was over here in this room and somebody moved it out here. Okay? Now, you always need to indicate where north is. Okay? Why do you suppose that's important? Well, it gives you perspective in the room or in the area where the crime occurred. Then, labels need to be present representing the evidence. Now, looking at that crime scene sketch that's in the bottom right-hand corner, do you see any labels? You don't. And that's usually because there is a key associated with it. Just like when you draw a map, there's always a key. Okay? Step 6, you're going to search for evidence. So at this point, all the evidence, excuse me, there's photographs that have been taken, the sketch has been done, everything's been measured. So you're going to continue to search for any additional evidence by using any one of 4 search patterns. You can see 2 of them on here. And we're going to A, spiral. Okay, start at the outermost part of the scene and search in a spiral towards the center. of the scene or a body or other significant piece of evidence found at the scene to ensure that you've looked at the entire area. That type of search pattern might be good for a circular room or something else circular in terms of the environment. A grid pattern occurs when you start at one corner of the room and basically you walk in a zigzag pattern across the whole room, then you go back perpendicular and zigzag back through, okay? There's also a linear pattern in which you just move in a straight line back and forth. It's basically the grid pattern, but without going back over your tracks. Then there's the quadrant method, and sometimes when you watch CSI on TV, this is how they do it. They divide the area to be searched into sections. Sometimes they have like little pieces of like, not twine, not rope, but something skinny that divides up the area into sections, and then each section is divided up even smaller, and then every quadrant is labeled. So the pattern itself should be walked in the location of evidence marked, as well as photographed and sketched. So now, as the evidence gets collected, and we've had the opportunity to look at this already, you have to secure and collect that evidence. So as the evidence is packaged, it must be done properly and sealed and labeled using specific techniques and procedures. Those we already went over in class. Then we have to secure and collect the evidence in appropriate containers. So we have to use the appropriate size and the appropriate type. For example, body fluids need to be in a porous container. If they're in a container that doesn't breathe, what did we learn from the O.J. Simpson trial? Hopefully you got that we learned that some of those body fluids could grow bacteria. Okay, so we need to keep it in a porous container. Glass or other breakables should be in a rigid container so that they don't break any further and that so that the person handling the evidence doesn't get hurt. Metal objects should also be in a rigid container. Trace evidence like fiber evidence, that type of thing, should be in a container that allows for no leakage whatsoever. Now, arson, on the other hand, should be in a non-porous container. It should not be in something breathable. Arson, hopefully you know, is fire. But when you look at arson, when you study evidence through arson, anything that was burned might have residue on it. It might have a specific odor to it, and that sometimes can lead us to understanding maybe what caused the fire or if there was an accelerant involved. And so by keeping it in that non-porous container, it maintains that scent. So remember, observation, we got to use all 5 senses. Now, when securing and collecting that evidence, separate containers need to be used for each piece of evidence. So packaging the evidence separately prevents damage through contact and prevents cross-contamination. Of course, as we learned from the O.J. Simpson trial, gloves need to be worn. So label the outside of the container with a minimum of the collector's name, date, time, and description of evidence. Then seal the container by covering the opening and placing the collector's initials and date on the seal. The only thing that's different is that sometimes we see we have a body at the scene, and the body itself creates more evidence because we're going to want to collect samples of hair and fiber that might be present on the individual that might indicate or be as a result of Locard's principle of exchange. We're going to want to take a sample of their clothing as well as a blood sample, collect any bullets from the body if necessary, look at fingernail scrapings. And so you can see over here that there's a photograph of the trimmed off fingernails, okay, with the ruler to indicate that those were the fingernails that were collected. In some cases, there's going to be an oral, an anal, and a vaginal swab, especially if there was any sexual assault involved. Then there would be organ samples taken for testing, especially if they believe that there was drugs involved or poisoning involved. So the evidence log and the chain of custody must be attached to the evidence container, and we've already gone over all of that. In terms of packaging the evidence, Each piece of evidence should be wrapped in its appropriate sized bindle. That should say bindle, not bundle right there. Please fix that. And placed in an evidence sealed bag. Okay. With the collector's signature along with the taped edge. Okay, remember we did that in our lab already. There's also a diagram in the book if you have the opportunity to look at it. So the chain of custody is always filled out. That ensures proper procedure and protocol, so that way it can be maintained in terms of responsible handling of evidence from the crime scene to the courtroom. Then it goes to the crime scene lab and the evidence gets analyzed so the investigation team can determine the facts of the case and eventually, hopefully, reconstruct the case or reconstruct the crime scene. At that point, the crime scene could be released, and you want to try and do that in a reasonable amount of time. So if there's a crime scene, if something happened in an apartment, you want to be able to release that apartment to the owner as quickly as possible. So before you release it, you want to check one last time for evidence that might have been missed and record who the scene was released to and the date and the time it was released. Now, there are some police officers, some investigation officers, that their specialty is actually crime scene reconstruction. And this is going to be forming a hypothesis of the sequence of events from before the crime was committed through its commission. If you came upon this scene, what might you think happened? Think about it. What kind of evidence do we see? Jeans in the road. There's something that's spilled here. The truck is overturned. The car door or the truck door is open. It looks like there's damage to the back end. Okay, so think about it. I'm not going to give you an answer. I just want you to think about it. So what we have to be super careful of are staged crime scenes. Staged crime scenes are when the perpetrator tries to make it look like a murder, takes a murder and tries to set it up to look like a suicide. That can cause many problems because the evidence doesn't match the testimony of the witnesses. So I just thought this was cute and a fun way to end. So it was a tough case, plenty of witnesses, but nobody was talking. Get it? It's in the library. Too cute, Mrs. Learned, you're so funny.